They laughed when I bled. Not because it was funny, but because in this family, my pain had always been a kind of entertainment. I'd spent years trying to keep the peace, lowering my voice, shrinking myself, taking the blame just to hold us together. Every apology felt like another stitch closing a wound they refused to see. But that night, as their laughter echoed through the house and warm blood soaked through my shirt, something inside me stopped breaking. It hardened. I finally understood that silence wasn't kindness, it was permission. So I stopped giving it, and they have no idea what that silence is about to cost them. The highway to Colorado Springs glittered with shards of ice, every curve reflecting my headlights like a cracked mirror. 7 years away, and still, the mountains knew how to make a person feel small. I hadn't planned on coming back, but when my mother's heart surgery failed to go as smoothly as she wanted people to believe, I packed up the silence of my apartment in Denver and drove through the storm. The house stood half buried under snow on the side of the ridge, same warped shutters, same roof bowing under decades of neglect. The porch light flickered weakly, not bright enough to feel like a welcome. Inside, everything smelled the same: aged pine, detergent, and something faintly metallic from the old radiator that never stopped rattling. The wind slipped through the cracks in the windows like it had a key. I dropped my duffel bag by the stairs. The kitchen light glowed yellow, soft but tired. My mother sat at the table, still in her robe, pretending not to be exhausted. Across from her was Arthur, her second husband, reading the newspaper like he was posing for a picture that no one would ever frame. And leaning against the counter was Ethan, my half-brother, 35, unshaven, with a beard dangling from his hand like an accessory. They looked up at me as if the door had opened by mistake. "Well," Arthur said, folding his paper, "look who remembered where home is." My mother smiled that careful, rehearsed smile, the one she used at church and hospital receptions. "Rowena, honey, you made it. The roads weren't too bad?" I told her they were fine. That was a lie. I'd driven through near whiteout conditions. But the truth never landed well in this house. Ethan clinked his bottle on the counter. "Guess the city life finally bored you." His voice carried that lazy arrogance of someone who'd never been told no long enough to believe he didn't have to change. Arthur chuckled. "At least you'll get some fresh air up here. All that computer stuff can't be healthy." My mother tilted her head in agreement. "You must get lonely, working from home all the time. At least Ethan sees real people every day." I almost laughed at that, but it came out as a breath through my nose. "My work has people too," I said. "Just different ones." Arthur shrugged like the topic wasn't worth continuing. Ethan smirked into his beer. My mother changed the subject to the neighbor's new puppy, and I was dismissed without a word. It struck me then how easily they edited me out of their world, how normal it felt for them. Later that night, the house was quiet except for the wind dragging across the siding. Snow pressed against the windows, turning the world outside into a gray blur. I unpacked in my old room, still painted that pale color my mother thought made the space soothing. There were no traces of me left here, no photos, no books, no memory that I had ever been more than a visitor. Downstairs, I could hear Ethan laughing at something on the television. The laugh hadn't changed. It still carried that careless edge that used to make me shrink as a child. I sat on the bed, lacing my fingers together, forcing my breathing to steady. I had spent so many years learning to read data sets, learning to find patterns in chaos, but nothing in my life had trained me for this house. Here, the rules were always emotional and unwritten. Arthur's pride was untouchable. My mother's comfort came before truth. Ethan's failures were everyone else's fault, and me. My role was to stay quiet enough not to disturb the illusion of peace. At dinner, the pattern held. My mother served stew. Arthur talked about local politics, and Ethan talked about a job lead that everyone pretended was real. I tried to ask about her recovery, about her medications, but she waved me off. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. You know how you get too serious. Too serious. That was the phrase she'd used my entire life. It meant stop trying to fix things. Stop noticing what's broken. Arthur raised his glass toward Ethan. Here's to your new start, son. Ethan grinned, basking in the small ceremony of it. The toast wasn't meant for me, but I lifted my water anyway. To new starts, I said quietly. No one echoed it. After dinner, they drifted toward the living room, leaving dishes piled in the sink. I washed them alone, the steam rising into the cold kitchen, my reflection ghostly in the window pane. Outside, the night swallowed the ridge. Inside, laughter rolled from the next room, distant and thin. When the last plate was dry, I leaned on the counter, hands damp, heart slow. I caught my own reflection in the glass again. The woman staring back looked steady, composed, even bored. But beneath that stillness was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the awareness that I had nothing left to prove to any of them, that the peace I'd been protecting all my life had never belonged to me. I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, listening to the creak under every step. In the hallway, the air was cold enough to make my breath visible. I stopped outside my mother's door, heard the faint hum of the oxygen machine, the rhythm of a house pretending to be alive. When I reached my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the snow fall outside the window. It came down heavier now, thick and soundless, blurring the line between the world and the sky, the kind of snow that hides everything, even the things you should have seen coming. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the years I'd confused endurance with love. I'd told myself silence kept us safe. But looking at that endless white outside, I realized silence had only kept me small. I don't know what shifted in me that night. Maybe it was the way their laughter drifted up through the floorboards. Maybe it was the way the snow refused to stop falling, as if the world itself was trying to bury what this house really was. All I know is that something in me went still, and when it did, a decision took its place. The next time they tried to turn me into a ghost, I wouldn't disappear, and the silence they taught me to keep, it was about to speak for itself. A week after I came back, my mother declared she felt strong enough for a small celebration. That was her phrase, small, harmless, ordinary. The kind of thing that didn't make her heart race, but did make her world look perfect again. She strung warm lights across the porch, played old country music, and invited the same neighbors who'd spent years pretending they didn't notice the shouting in this house. Outside, snow kept falling in a steady hush, turning the railing white. The yellow light reflected off the flakes like gold dust, and for a moment, everything almost looked peaceful. But that warmth was a trick of the bulbs, not of the people under them. Arthur stood at the head of the table, lifting his glass high. He always loved to give toasts when there was something, or someone, to take credit for. To Ethan, he said, his voice booming over the hum of conversation. Finally putting his life in order, 2 weeks on the job at the garage, and not a single complaint from his boss. That's my boy. Everyone laughed, my mother clapping like it was a graduation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning, soaking it in. 2 weeks. It didn't even sound like a sentence. Yet they said it like an achievement carved in stone. When there was a lull, I tried to join in the conversation, talking about the project I'd been managing for months. It wasn't about status. I just wanted to share something that mattered to me. But before I could finish the first sentence, my mother's voice cut clean through mine. Oh, Rowena, let's not talk about work tonight. You always sound so serious. Relax. Enjoy the party. You should take a page from Ethan's book. He knows how to have fun. Laughter again. Softer this time, but sharp. I smiled back, because that's what I'd trained myself to do. Smile when the sting hit. It was a reflex now, like breathing. Through the noise, I realized I'd heard this moment before, 100 different ways. Every birthday, every holiday, every dinner, where I showed up thinking it would be different. The script never changed. My achievements were quiet embarrassments. His failures were charming quirks. From where I sat, The glow of the string lights threw a halo over Ethan's face. The same light hit me too, but somehow it never looked the same on me. In this house, you were either adored or ignored. There was no in-between. The neighbors asked questions about my job, polite but confused. I kept my answers vague, said it was a government position involving financial data. Their eyes glazed. Arthur saved them the trouble of pretending interest. "It's just computer work," he said with a smile that wasn't one. "She's always been into that techie stuff." Murmurs of approval followed. Safe job, good benefits, boring, exactly the kind of work that could be dismissed without guilt. When the plates were cleared and the music softened, everyone drifted outside to roast marshmallows under the awning. I stayed behind, claiming I needed to tidy the kitchen. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the real reason either. The quiet was a relief. The sink was full of glasses, still warm from the dishwasher. I ran water over them just to hear something steady, something neutral. That's when I caught it. The low, muffled sound of a voice coming from the garage. "Ethan's!" At first, I ignored it. I'd learned the hard way that curiosity in this house often turned to regret, but then a phrase cut through the hum of the heater, clear enough to freeze me in place. "Money's been transferred. Don't worry. Mexico confirmed the receipt." The clink of metal tools followed, then silence. I turned off the faucet. The only sound left was the rush of blood in my ears. Mexico. Transferred. Confirmed. My hands were wet, but it wasn't from the dishes. I wiped them on a towel and stood still, listening again. But the conversation was over. He'd either hung up or walked out of range. The words replayed in my head like numbers on a screen, aligning themselves with something I didn't want to see clearly yet. My work wasn't supposed to touch this world, the world of this family. It dealt with faceless accounts, encrypted transfers, shell companies spanning continents. But every now and then, the data lined up too neatly to ignore. And just like that, Ethan's voice had dropped into that alignment. Mexico. Transfers. Clean. My chest tightened. I dried my hands, walked to my room, and shut the door quietly behind me. The noise from the porch was distant again. Arthur's laughter, the crackle of the fire, my mother's delighted hum. It sounded like life was happening somewhere else, in someone else's home. I sat at my desk, flipped open my laptop, and the blue light filled the dark room. I typed a few words into an encrypted document. Suspicious pattern match. Subject E. Clark. Colorado region. Source. Personal observation. My fingers hesitated for only a second before I entered the private code that would lock the file. The system confirmed the save with a soft ping, a tiny sound that felt louder than any of the laughter outside. I leaned back, eyes on the glow of the screen reflected in the window. Snow kept falling, steady, quiet, relentless. It covered everything, the porch, the cars, the roads, just like it always had. But underneath that clean, white surface, something dark was moving. And now, I knew it wasn't just a feeling. It had a name, a timestamp, a trail. I closed the laptop and sat there, the hum of the house settling around me. The party outside went on. Toasts, laughter, music. They thought tonight was a celebration. I knew better. This wasn't family anymore. It was evidence. The house felt colder than usual that morning, though the heater hummed nonstop. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from the air, but from the way people avoided looking at one another. Ethan spent the day wandering between the couch and the fridge, cracking open beers before noon, eyes dull and unfocused. My mother followed him with soft warnings and sad smiles, then turned to me with the same weary sigh she used when I was 10 and refused to apologize for things I hadn't done. "You always make everything so tense." "Rowena." I didn't answer. I rarely did. Arguing with her only fed the story she'd written about me years ago, the one where my quiet was arrogance and my boundaries were cruelty. That night, the silence in the house stretched thin. Snow pressed against the windows, and the walls seemed to creak under the weight of everything unsaid. I sat at my desk, the blue glow of my laptop washing across my hands. That light had become the only thing in this house that made sense. Steady, responsive, obedient. It didn't twist my words or rewrite my intentions. It just told the truth. Line by line, number by number, I worked until my eyes blurred. When I finally stood to stretch, the clock read 1:17 m. Downstairs, the television murmured under Ethan's snores. I turned off the lamp and left the room to make tea. When I came back, my stomach dropped. My laptop screen was on. It took a few seconds for my brain to register what I was seeing. The encrypted file I'd locked behind a 12-character password was open. Lines of data filled the screen, scrolling slowly as if someone had just exited the document. I froze. Then instinct took over. I opened the system log. The entry glared back at me. Unauthorized access. External attempt from internal IP. The timestamp matched the few minutes I'd been out of the room. I didn't need to guess. Only one person in this house thought every secret was about him. I closed the lid, heart hammering in my throat. For a long moment, I stood in the dark, the sound of my pulse louder than the wind outside. By the time I came down for breakfast, Ethan was waiting. He leaned against the doorway like he'd been practicing the pose all night. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath thick with beer and bitterness. "Who do you really work for? Rowena? FBI? IRS? Or are you watching me for someone else?" I poured coffee without looking at him. His voice carried that same tremor I'd heard once when we were kids, when he'd been caught stealing from Arthur's wallet and couldn't decide whether to lie or lash out. I said quietly, "You're not interesting enough to watch, Ethan. But if there's something you're afraid of being found, maybe you should tell yourself first." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. His jaw tightened. Something dark flickered behind his eyes, and I knew I'd hit the bruise he'd been hiding. He smirked, but it didn't reach his face. "Careful," he muttered, and walked away. That should have been the end of it, but from that moment on, I could feel him in the corners of my days, the creak of a floorboard behind me, the sound of his phone camera when I passed the hall, the way his laughter cut short whenever I entered the room. My mother noticed the tension, but, as always, mistook its source. One afternoon, she cornered me by the sink, lowering her voice to that tone reserved for family shame. "You scare people. Rowena, you always have. Can't you try to be softer?" Softer. That word again. It was the cure she prescribed for every problem. Be smaller, be quieter, let them win, even when they're wrong. I rinsed the plate in my hands, feeling the hot water sting my fingers. The truth was simple. Softness had never saved me. It had only made me easier to ignore. The following evening, the air felt heavier. Snow fell soundlessly, wrapping the house in a pale glow. Ethan hadn't said a word all day, but I could feel his attention like static on the back of my neck. Every instinct told me to pack my things and leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to know how far this went. Just past midnight. I sat at my desk again, the screen light flickering against the frost-covered window. I was reviewing flagged transactions when a small red notification blinked at the corner of the screen. System alert. Unauthorized access attempt. Internal source. Location. Clark residence. My breath caught. The agency's monitoring software had detected another intrusion, not just local, but deep. An attempt to mirror my secure files. The system automatically labeled it Internal Security Risk, Priority Level 2. That meant the next step wasn't up to me anymore. I stared at the words on the screen, the cursor blinking steadily like a heartbeat. If he kept pushing, if he opened the wrong file, the system would escalate. He'd trigger a federal review, and the investigation I'd been quietly building would no longer belong to me. It would consume him, and maybe everyone else under this roof. I stood by the window, hands gripping the edge of the sill. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the driveway, the trees, the porch where the lights still hung from last week's party. The world looked peaceful again, white, clean, untouched. But it wasn't peace, it was cover. I watched the flakes blur the night until everything disappeared into gray. Somewhere downstairs, a floorboard creaked, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. The truth was no longer something I could contain in a file or protect behind encryption. It was alive now, moving through the walls of this house, breathing beside me. I knew then what the data had already told me. This wasn't just a home anymore. It was a fault line. And one more step from him, one more careless move, would bring everything down. The silence around me tightened like a string pulled too far. I shut off the screen and stood in the dark, the faint reflection of my face fading in the glass. Snow kept falling, and beneath it, something dangerous had already begun to stir. The sky outside was the color of iron, dense and silent. Snow had piled high along the balcony rail, blurring the edges of the world. I'd been at my desk for hours, the house asleep. The only light a pale blue square reflected in the window. The keys clicked in rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Every sound was small, contained, the kind of quiet that makes you believe nothing could possibly go wrong. I stood to make tea. My joints ached from sitting too long. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed, a sound too steady to be comforting. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the stillness broke, a sharp, heavy bang against the kitchen door. Ethan was there, leaning against the frame. His breath came in short bursts, steeped in alcohol. The look in his eyes wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition. The ugly kind. "You told them, didn't you?" he said. "You've been sending reports, numbers, emails. You think I don't see? You want to destroy me?" My mouth went dry. "No one's destroying you. Ethan, you just—" I didn't finish. He lunged forward, his hand closing around my wrist, his grip burning through the fabric of my sweater. A glint of steel flashed under the kitchen light, one of the butcher knives from the counter. I twisted, but not fast enough. Pain tore through my shoulder, white and hot. The knife sank deep, scraping bone. The world folded inward. The smell of metal filled my lungs. Blood poured warm down my arm as I stumbled back against the fridge. The clock on the wall ticked once, then twice. 2:03, ma'am. I heard movement from the living room, the creak of the couch, my mother's voice cutting through the haze. "Rowena, stop overreacting." Ethan didn't mean it. Then, a soft laugh. I pressed my hand to the wound, the warmth of it spilling between my fingers. The floor beneath me felt cold as stone. My vision pulsed, dimming at the edges. The house stayed perfectly still, no footsteps, no help. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and wet. I forced my hand into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb trembled over the screen as I opened the encrypted application, one I'd hoped I'd never need. SOS 971. A 3-second press, a faint vibration. Then the screen blinked alive, words glowing soft blue through the blur of tears. Signal transmitted. Awaiting verification. That was the last thing I saw clearly, the pulsing light of the transmission. My lifeline. The only witness that couldn't lie. Then everything slid into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, the world smelled like disinfectant and metal. A steady beeping filled the silence. I tried to lift my hand, but pain snapped through my shoulder, clean and sharp. A white bandage cut across my chest like a stripe of frost. 2 men in dark suits stood at the foot of the bed. Their presence carried the weight of authority that never needed to raise its voice. One of them spoke, his tone professional, almost kind. "Ms. Clark, you're safe. The 9-71 signal was received and verified. We located you within 17 minutes. I blinked, struggling to focus. My lips cracked as I asked, barely above a whisper. "Where's my family? They said you fell into a cabinet. Local police are treating it as a domestic accident. But for us, this is different. This was an assault on a federal employee." He didn't have to explain what that meant. I'd been on the other side of these investigations too many times to mistake the gravity. The law had its own way of peeling back truth. When they left, the room fell silent again, except for the monitor's beep. I stared at the ceiling's fluorescent light, sterile and relentless, thinking about the irony of it all. My own house, classified now as a crime scene, and I was both the witness and the evidence. A knock at the door. My mother stepped in, clutching a basket of fruit wrapped in clear plastic. Her perfume, powdery and faintly floral, hit me before she spoke. "You scared me," she said softly. "I told them you must have slipped. Ethan's sick over it. Please, let's not make this worse than it already is." Her voice was honey poured over glass shards. I looked at her for a long time. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I could have told her the truth, described the blade, the blood, the seconds between impact and blackout. But what was the point? In her story, accidents were always easier to forgive. So I nodded once. "I won't make it worse," I said. Her shoulders relaxed. She smiled as if she'd won something. When she left, the room felt larger and emptier all at once. I waited until the echo of her heels disappeared down the hall before reaching for the bedside phone. My fingers were steady now. I dialed the internal number I'd memorized years ago, reserved for incidents requiring immediate escalation. "This is Rowena Clark," I said. "Reporting physical assault on a federal employee. 9 to 71 activation confirmed. I'm requesting case verification and transfer of evidence." The words came out even, almost mechanical, somewhere between the pain and the protocol. I felt the shift. The fragile daughter, the quiet sister, the easy scapegoat. She dissolved into the sterile air of that hospital room. For the first time in years, my voice carried weight. I hung up and stared at the blinking light above the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall, turning the windows into sheets of white. Whatever illusion of family had survived up until that night was gone. Something colder and far more precise had taken its place. And as the machines hummed around me, I realized what I'd known deep down for years. I hadn't called for help. I'd called for evidence. The first thing I saw when I woke was light, white, sterile, endless. It pressed against my eyelids until I blinked it into focus. A slow, mechanical beeping followed, syncing perfectly with my pulse. I turned my head, and the world tilted slightly. The room sliding into shape, ceiling tiles, IV lines, the faint red glow from an ambulance parked beneath the falling snow outside the window. The pain was dulled, distant, something managed by medicine, the kind of pain that doesn't scream anymore. It just hums to remind you it's there. I stared at the drip moving through the IV tube, counting each drop like data. Every beat of my heart was measurable, predictable, something I could analyze. It grounded me. It meant I was still here. By the time the nurse adjusted my blanket, I had already started cataloging what happened. No fear, just process, like reading a case file. That's what shock does to people like me. It turns survival into documentation. The snow outside was still falling, thicker now, blanketing the ambulance roof until its red lights smeared through the window, like paint bleeding through water. I watched it for a long time before the door opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, shaking snow from their boots. They were polite, almost too polite. The younger one carried a clipboard. The older one looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They asked the same questions I'd answered 100 times on the other side of a table. Time, place, weapon, witnesses. I gave them what they needed. Simple, concise. Ethan attacked me in the kitchen. My family was present, but did not intervene. The younger officer scribbled, eyes flicking up briefly, as if to gauge whether I believed my own words. The older one nodded, though his face didn't move much. They thanked me for my cooperation, told me they'd be in touch, then left. Their doubt lingered after them, heavier than their boots had been. Later that afternoon, the door opened again. This time, the sound of shoes on linoleum was sharper, deliberate. 2 men in dark suits walked in, badges visible, not local. Their movements carried the precision of people who lived by systems, not by feelings. One of them placed a folder on the bedside table, thick, sealed, marked with a red federal insignia. His voice was low, calm. The system recorded everything. Ms. Clark, audio, light fluctuation, temperature change, and spatial coordinates. Enough to confirm your account. I nodded once. The words didn't comfort me, but they stabilized me, the way truth always does. I want it handled through the proper channel, I said. Procedure only. The man met my eyes for a second, then closed the folder. Understood. They left as quietly as they came, and for the first time that day, I exhaled. The sound echoed in the room, a single breath reclaiming space. That night, I stood in the bathroom, the air humming faintly with the sound of the fluorescent light. The mirror was fogged around the edges. I unwrapped the bandage from my shoulder. Slow, careful. The wound was smaller than I expected, but deeper. Stitches ran across my skin, black and uneven. I touched the edge, not to test the pain, but to remember it. Pain fades fast when you let others define it for you. I needed it to stay real. Don't let them rewrite this. I told myself, not again. Back in bed, the room dark except for the monitor's glow. I opened my laptop. The hospital Wi-Fi was weak, but my encrypted line connected instantly. I logged into the system, entered my clearance code, and reviewed the file. The digital report from 2:03 a.m. played through my earbuds. Faint static. Then sound. My voice. The impact. The scrape of metal. And then, her voice. Don't make a scene. Rowena? Ethan didn't mean it, followed by laughter. Soft. Almost affectionate. The sound carved through me more cleanly than the blade had. The system didn't know what it had captured. It wasn't built to recognize betrayal. But I did. That laugh would be the anchor of everything that came next. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. That the cruelty wasn't abstract. It had a sound, a timestamp, a frequency. By morning, I learned my mother and Arthur had already given their statements. The nurse brought the local paper, folded neatly, her face tight with pity. The article summarized it in 3 lines. Family dispute leads to minor injury. Sources confirm stress and mental health issues may have been a factor. Arthur told them I had slipped. Ethan told them I'd lashed out first. My mother said I'd been unstable since my divorce. 3 voices, 1 script. I closed the paper and set it aside. I didn't feel anger, just a kind of detachment, like watching strangers rehearse a lie so well they forgot it wasn't true. They didn't know what I knew. The 9-71 file hadn't just logged movement and temperature, it had recorded the conversation in full, stored under a security layer they couldn't reach. Every word, every laugh, preserved with federal precision. That file was my weapon now, but not the kind they'd expect. I wasn't going to use it to hurt them. I was going to let it speak in court, in language they'd never learned, the language of evidence. When night fell again, I pulled up a blank document. My shoulder throbbed, but the ache steadied my hands. I began typing, the rhythm as even as a heartbeat. Incident 02:03 a.m. Confirmed. Subject, E. Clark. Additional data pending. Emotional response. Neutral. Each word felt deliberate, exact. I didn't add adjectives or justifications. There was power in restraint. Proof didn't need passion. When I clicked save, a small message blinked at the corner of the screen. Data uploaded successfully. The red indicator light reflected on the glass beside me, pulsing steady and slow. For a second, it looked like it was beating inside my eye. That light, cold, unwavering, was the only one I trusted now, because it didn't comfort. It didn't lie. It just recorded. Mara arrived 2 days later, stepping off the elevator with a small gray suitcase and the kind of focus that made rooms fall silent. She didn't ask if I was all right. She just looked at me once, sharp and assessing, before saying, I've read the 9-71 log. The system caught everything. We don't argue, we present. She unpacked her materials onto the table. Printed reports, heat maps, audio spectrograms, chain of custody forms. The sunlight from the window bounced off the glossy paper, cold and surgical. My apartment, still half sterile from the hospital, smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Mara spread the documents out like pieces of anatomy. Each page revealed a layer: infrared satellite imagery of the house, timestamps, ambient sound fluctuations, paramedic notes, the full 911 transcript. There was no emotion in her tone as she explained each file. Truth didn't need sympathy, it needed precision. "My mother will never stop," I said quietly, eyes tracing the red line of data across the graph. "Then let the evidence stop her." Mara replied. The way she said it, steady, factual, made something inside me unclench. For weeks, everything had been noise, accusation, pity. Now, for the first time, it was numbers, verified coordinates, measurable facts. Mara worked like she was dissecting a body, methodical, exact, unsparing. Within hours, she uncovered a transfer, $40,000, wired to Arthur's personal account from a shell company named White River Logistics. It took one cross-reference with Treasury databases to confirm what I already suspected. It was a front used by the same laundering network I'd been investigating before any of this began. Arthur wasn't just complicit. He was part of the system I'd been chasing all along. When Mara slid the printed statement toward me, I didn't feel shock, just clarity. My family hadn't turned against me because of loyalty to Ethan. They were protecting themselves. She picked up her phone and made a brief call. Voice clipped. Professional. Within an hour, an FBI liaison from the Financial Crimes Division was looped in. The case that had started as domestic disturbance was now flagged under active federal interest. That night, the snow returned, heavy, relentless. Mara worked at the table, her laptop casting a white glow against the walls. I sat by the window, watching flakes blur the lights of Denver below. The air felt cleaner here than it had in that mountain house, but the cold was the same. Familiar. Honest. By morning, Ethan had vanished. No one had heard from him in 48 hours. His phone pinged last from a rest stop outside Pueblo, then went dark. The FBI task force issued a discreet bolo, keeping it internal for now. Mara didn't say the words out loud, but we both knew what it meant. He was running. That afternoon, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but the sound of her name still did something to me, a reflex older than reason. Her voice shook. "Rowena, please. Ethan's gone. Don't let them find him. We can fix this if you stop. If you just stop." I stared at the snow melting down the window pane, the trail of water carving a line through the frost. "I already stopped," I said. "Now it's the system's turn." There was silence, then the click of disconnection. By nightfall, Mara's contacts confirmed what we'd both been waiting for. Ethan had been picked up at a gas station 30 miles north of the Mexican border. He'd tried to withdraw money from a flagged account, the same one tied to White River Logistics. The bank alert triggered federal tracking within seconds. He hadn't even made it out of the parking lot. Arthur's accounts were frozen by morning. Investigators found additional transfers buried under a trail of false invoices. The story my family had built, of mental instability, of misunderstanding, collapsed under the weight of the records they couldn't manipulate. When Mara told me, her tone didn't change. She wasn't gloating. She was confirming a fact, another entry in the ledger of cause and consequence. "They'll be charged separately," she said, tapping the edge of a document. "Conspiracy to defraud, obstruction, false testimony, the usual spiral." I nodded. It felt strange to hear justice phrased in the same rhythm as accounting. Strange, and deeply right. Later, we drove downtown to the Justice Department's Denver office, a glass tower that gleamed white against the gray sky. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee and ozone from the copiers. Mara led me to a conference room on the 12th floor. The table was bare, except for the stack of evidence files, sealed and tagged. She took a seat across from me, crossing her legs. Outside the window, snow fell softly over the city, glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Do you want to see them before the hearing?" she asked. "Your mother, Arthur." I shook my head. "No. They'll see justice. That's enough." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full of every word that didn't need to be said. Through the glass, the city lights shimmered in pale rose, each one blurred by falling snow. The evidence file sat between us like a wall, not made of anger, but of proof. A wall they couldn't climb, no matter how many stories they told. The hum of the building filled the room, low and constant. Somewhere, a printer started up, spitting out another report. The sound reminded me of gears turning, of a machine far larger than either of us. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It moves quietly, grinding forward until the resistance wears away. I looked out at the snow melting on the window, streaks of water tracing the glass. That's what truth sounds like. I thought, not shouting, not revenge. Metal shifting in the cold, inevitable, steady, unstoppable. April in Colorado never fully decides between winter and rebirth. Snow clung to the edges of the valley like the last memory of something cold that refused to die. As I walked up the courthouse steps, the air was sharp enough to taste metal. Inside, the silence was absolute, too clean, too careful, the kind of silence that only exists where judgment is about to be delivered. The courtroom was small, unremarkable, the beige walls peeling slightly near the ceiling. The benches creaked under the weight of too many stifled breaths. Light from the high windows spilled across the floor, harsh and pure, turning dust motes into fragments of glass. Ethan sat at the defense table beside his lawyer, Dale Warner. His skin had the color of wet paper, his eyes unfocused, jaw tight. Behind him, my mother sat with her hands clasped over her purse, knuckles white, lips trembling, but not from guilt, from disbelief. Arthur stayed in the corner, head low, the kind of quiet that isn't remorse but strategy. Mara Lynn stood beside me, calm as a scalpel. Her suit was charcoal, her hair pinned back neatly, her expression unreadable. Between us, the evidence binder lay thick and heavy, the red seal of the Department of Justice stamped clean across the cover. When the judge entered, the room shifted, people straightened, breaths caught. All that remained of conversation evaporated. Dale Warner rose first, clearing his throat like an actor waiting for his cue. His voice filled the chamber, too confident for the truth he was about to tell. Your Honor, this is not a criminal act. It's a family matter. A middle-aged woman, emotionally unstable, suffering from post-divorce stress, has misinterpreted an accident. There's no recording, no footage, no objective witness. Only a story. Hers. He paused, gesturing toward me like an exhibit. I kept my gaze on the wood grain of the table. It was smooth and old, worn down by years of hands reaching for something they couldn't hold. When he sat, the silence felt heavier. The judge looked toward Mara. She stood slowly, gathering her papers, and spoke without raising her voice. The Department of Justice submits the official 9-71 emergency report. Included are time-synced recordings, satellite verification, and forensic data confirming the physical evidence. Her words landed like quiet hammer strikes. Measured. Final. The clerk took the sealed binder to the bench. The judge broke the seal, unfolded the documents, and began to read. Each turn of the page sounded impossibly loud, like the steady tick of a clock counting down to something irreversible. At 2:03 a.m., Department of Justice employee Rowena Clark activated Federal Emergency Protocol 9-71. The judge read, "Medical examination confirms injuries consistent with a sharp instrument approximately 8 inches in length. The recorded audio captures physical struggle, impact, and the voice of a female, later identified as Lydia Clark, stating, 'Don't make a scene. Rowena.' Ethan didn't mean it. No one moved. The air thickened. The sound of the heating vent filled the room, the only thing alive enough to move. Ethan's head dropped into his hands. Arthur's jaw twitched, his grip on the bench turning his fingers white. My mother stood abruptly, her voice breaking, the denial spilling out before thought could form. "No, That's not, I didn't. It must be. The judge didn't look up. His voice stayed steady, clipped, and precise. The court finds sufficient evidence to determine that Ethan Clark committed assault on a federal employee. A permanent restraining order is hereby granted. The case file will be forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office for Federal Prosecution. The gavel struck wood. Once, sharp, final. And then, nothing. No gasps, no whispers, not even the sound of shifting seats. Just the heavy quiet of something breaking that would never be repaired. I drew in a breath, the air cool in my lungs. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like oxygen after being underwater too long. Mara closed the binder, sliding it neatly into her briefcase. Her hand brushed my arm, a silent signal that we were done here. As we walked toward the exit, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their faces, Ethan's collapse, my mother's disbelief, Arthur's silent calculation, would live behind me, where they belonged, at the doorway. Mara spoke softly, almost to herself. Your silence just made the whole room listen. I didn't answer. The light from the corridor spilled over us, bright and sterile. Outside, the last snow of the season had begun to melt along the courthouse steps, water running thin and clear through the cracks in the stone. For the first time in months, I could hear my own footsteps without fear trailing behind them. Justice didn't roar. It didn't demand to be seen. It simply echoed once, then settled. Quiet, clean, and absolute. A week after the trial, I was back at the Justice Department's Denver office. The city was still thawing from winter, sunlight reflecting off wet pavement and patches of stubborn snow clinging to rooftops. From the 12th floor, the world below looked orderly, calm, like it had always been this way. But I knew better. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and toner. Glass walls reflected the silver morning light, sharp and sterile. On the far end of the table, a muted TV cycled through headlines, the words scrolling cleanly across the screen. Ethan Clark, suspect in assault of federal employee, transferred to FBI custody. No photo, no commentary. Just a line of text that reduced months of chaos to a single sentence. The next headline followed. Arthur Clark under federal investigation for money laundering tied to White River Logistics. My mother's name didn't appear at all. She had vanished from the news as if she'd never existed. No interviews, no follow-ups, no more trembling pleas for understanding. The reporters had moved on. The story no longer served them. I sat with my hands around a cooling cup of coffee, watching the reflection of the mountains beyond the glass. The last of the snow was sliding down their slopes in thin, glittering streams. Winter wasn't gone, but it was losing its grip. The elevator chimed softly. Mara Lynn stepped into the room, her dark coat draped over one arm, a stack of files under the other. She set a second cup in front of me, fresh, steaming, precise as always. You know, she said, settling across from me. This case is expanding faster than we thought. The evidence you collected, those logs from the 971 signal, helped us link White River to a larger network. Ethan was just one node in a long chain. I nodded. I figured he wasn't smart enough to build something like that alone. Mara smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to the papers. You don't need to thank me for any of this, she said. The data spoke for itself. We both laughed quietly. It was a dry, knowing sound, the kind that comes from people who've seen too much to celebrate. The truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like maintenance, like restoring balance after years of misalignment. When Mara left a few hours later, her seat still carried the warmth of her presence. I stared at the files she'd left behind, the red Department of Justice seals catching the light. Then I turned back to the window, tracing the outline of the mountains with my eyes. They looked distant, untouched by everything that had happened. That night, I came home to my apartment, a quiet space, sterile but mine. I turned on only one lamp, opened my laptop, and scrolled through my inbox. For weeks, I hadn't touched my personal email. Most messages were junk, unread newsletters, subscription reminders, digital clutter. And then I saw it, one new message, the subject line written in the same gentle tone that used to make me feel guilty for breathing. From Lydia Clark. My fingers hovered above the trackpad. For a moment, I thought about deleting it unopened. But curiosity, the old reflexive kind, won out. The message unfolded in clean black text against a white screen. You've torn this family apart. Ethan made a mistake, but he's still your brother. The world doesn't need to know everything. Please, don't let them humiliate us any further. You've always been so cold. Rowena, do you ever think about me? I read it twice, then a third time, letting each word settle where it hurt least. There was no apology, no recognition, just the same quiet manipulation wrapped in the language of love. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel grief, just stillness, like watching snow melt off a roof, drop by drop, and realizing you don't need to catch it. I printed the email, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a thin file labeled Case Clark, the same file that held the verdict, the data logs, the forensic reports, the names of everyone who had turned their back when truth cost too much. The email didn't belong to guilt anymore. It belonged to record. I didn't delete it or respond. Some things deserved to remain exactly as they were. Evidence, not conversation. Leaning back, I whispered to the empty room, the words barely leaving my lips. I've thought about you. Mother, I just stopped letting you decide who I am when I do. The words didn't carry pain this time, only finality. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The night was quiet, the city lights blinking like slow heartbeats in the distance. Down on the street, puddles caught the reflection of the lampposts, fractured and soft. The snow was almost gone now, leaving behind dark earth and shallow streams winding toward the drains. Change always looked messy up close, but from here, it was beautiful. In the reflection, I saw my own outline, tired but steady, the faint scar on my shoulder just visible where my collar slipped. I touched it lightly, not as a wound, but as proof. The world outside kept moving. Cars passed, lights flickered. Somewhere a siren wailed and then faded into the distance. I let it all wash through me, no longer flinching at the sound. Justice hadn't rebuilt what was broken. It hadn't made anyone better. It hadn't even felt like justice most of the time. But it had done something quieter, something that mattered more. It had ended the lie. And when the lie died, there was finally space to breathe. I took a deep breath, watching the glass fog for a moment before clearing again. Across the street, the cherry trees had begun to bloom, pale petals trembling in the early wind. They weren't loud, weren't triumphant, just alive. Maybe that's all justice ever really is, I thought. Not punishment, not balance, just the chance to begin again without fear. I turned off the light, leaving the city's glow to fill the room. Outside, the last shards of snow melted into the soil. Water trickled down the glass, tracing its slow path toward the ground. The world had moved on, and so had I. Justice hadn't changed everything, but it had given me this: a clean breath, a steady pulse, and the quiet certainty that I could finally live unafraid of my own story. For the first time in years, I didn't need to be believed. I just needed to exist. A year later, the world had grown quiet again. My new home sat just outside Denver, tucked along a mountain road that curved above the valley. From the porch, I could see the city in the distance, faint and shimmering under the morning sun. The air up here was thinner, cleaner. Silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was kind. The day began like all the others. Sunlight slid through the white curtains, painting soft lines across the floorboards. The smell of coffee drifted through the room, rich and steady, wrapping around the edges of the cold mountain air. I sat at the small table by the window, the same place I always started my mornings, watching steam rise from my cup while the wind brushed against the glass. The laptop hummed softly beside me, the screen filled with coded graphs and shifting data streams, numbers mapping the invisible routes of money moving across continents. It was strange how something so abstract could feel so human to me now. Maybe because this time, I wasn't hiding behind the data. I was leading it. Team lead. International Financial Analysis Division. The title still looked unreal whenever it appeared on my reports. More work, more responsibility, more people looking to me for direction. And yet, I felt lighter. Maybe because I no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood. Outside, the last of the winter frost clung to the railing, melting into droplets that glimmered before falling away. A hawk cut across the sky, slow and deliberate. The world didn't need to move fast anymore. Neither did I. I scrolled through the latest report, a set of flagged transactions linking offshore accounts to a new laundering network in Eastern Europe. Another chain to trace. Another web to untangle. Work like this never ended. But that was fine. The work had never been the burden. It was the noise that used to surround it, the voices doubting, dismissing, defining me, that had made it unbearable. Now, the only sound was the soft clicking of keys and the low hum of the heater. The scar on my shoulder caught the light. It had faded to a thin, silvery line, barely visible against my skin. I reached up and touched it out of habit. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a seal, proof that I had survived, that I had refused to let their story replace mine. For a moment, I stared at my reflection in the laptop screen. I didn't see the woman from the hospital or the courtroom or the headlines. I saw someone else entirely, someone who no longer needed to explain, or defend, or win. I opened the final file on my desktop. The document name was simple. Case Clark. Inside. One line blinked back at me. Case closed. Justice served. No drama. No explanation. Just that. I saved the file for the last time, then closed the laptop and let the sound of the lid shutting echo softly through the room. Stepping out onto the porch, I was met with the rush of cold air sweeping down from the mountains. The wind tugged at my hair, sharp but clean. I wrapped my hands around my mug, letting the warmth seep through my palms. From here, I could see where the snow had finally given up its hold, patches of green breaking through the white. The slow thaw of a world learning to breathe again. The silence was different now. It wasn't the tense, watchful quiet of that house in Colorado Springs. It was the kind of silence that follows peace, the kind earned, not given. I leaned against the railing and watched the sun climb higher, the sky turning from silver to gold. For the first time, I thought of Ethan and felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, just absence, clean and unmarked. Arthur's name came next, followed by my mother's. They, too, were part of a story that had already reached its ending. The laughter that used to echo in my head on sleepless nights had finally gone still. What remained was wind, real, cold, alive. Justice, I realized, had never been about making them bow. It was about learning to lift my own head again without shame. I looked down at my scar one last time, then let my hand fall to my side. It no longer needed to remind me of anything. The lesson had already settled deep into my bones, that survival isn't loud, and dignity doesn't need witnesses. The wind carried the faint scent of pine through the air, and somewhere in the valley below, a dog barked, the sound drifting upward, echoing briefly before fading into the open sky. My phone buzzed on the table behind me. A single notification glowed across the screen. Mara Lynn, congrats. Team lead. I smiled without opening it. I could picture her perfectly, leaning over her desk, back in D.C., coffee in hand, that sharp, knowing look still in her eyes. She would never say you deserved this. Mara didn't deal in sentiment, but I knew she meant it anyway. I took a slow sip of coffee, savoring its warmth. The wind picked up, rattling the empty chimes that hung by the porch. Below me, the city stretched toward the horizon. Tiny houses, winding roads, distant life. The world was still full of noise, chaos, injustice, but it no longer reached me. I wasn't retreating from it. I had simply learned where to stand. I stayed there until the mug was empty, until the air began to warm and the sun climbed higher over the ridge. One chapter had closed without ceremony. No verdicts, no applause, no spotlight. Just a clean, quiet ending written in the language of peace. I thought about the first night I'd driven back into Colorado Springs, the snow falling like ash, the silence heavy and cruel. How far that silence had come. How different it sounded now. I smiled to myself. No more shouting, no more fear, no more proof to deliver, just wind, sunlight, and the steady rhythm of my own breath, finally mine. The house creaked softly behind me, the sound settling into the day. And as I looked out at the mountains, the valley below glowing with spring light, I understood that justice had never been about the courtroom or the law. It was about this exact moment. Not the sound of a gavel, not the fall of snow or the echo of laughter, just the stillness of being heard. At last, the world below me kept moving. Birds cut across the sky. Traffic murmured in the distance. Life unfolded in all its messy, ordinary beauty. I turned my face to the wind and closed my eyes. A chapter had ended, and all that remained was peace.